All right, so September is finally here. And many of us are looking forward to new routines, new opportunities, and a new school year. A lot has happened in the last 6 months. Did you know that it was 6 months ago today that the first confirmed COVID test in Manitoba happened? So they had their first confirmed case. It's been 6 months. I don't know if if it feels like 6 months, if it feels like 6 days ago, if it feels like 60 years ago. A lot has happened. The pandemic arrived. And a number of issues have sprung from this. Stay home and stay safe, which has brought about isolation. The economic shutdown where millions of people have suffered financially. Businesses have been forced to close. The economy has been supported through government initiatives, resulting in long-term debt. The closing of schools, the closing of churches, the loss of recreational and physical well-being, the loss of freedom because of mandatory masks and physical distancing rules. For some, there's an issue of morality around governments telling churches not to hold public services because church events could become super spreader events. And then in May, the killing of George Floyd propels the issue of racial inequality and hatred back into the spotlight of our society, both in the US and in Canada. Protests are marred by rioting, looting, and violence. The reactions to Black Lives Matter movement show how deeply divided our society is. And then there's an election about to take place in the only country that we share a border with. And we may say, well, that's a different country. Yes, but the events in the US have a tremendous influence on the Canadian mindset. Culture, entertainment, economics, religious practices are all deeply influenced by the events in the US. Daniel, can you go to the next slide and probably even the one after?
Sorry, this is just a little message.
Where are we at? Okay. We're trying. Yeah, there. There's a picture for you. Because there's a lot going on. And then we come back to Canada and we have a Prime Minister and a former Finance Minister who have violated the trust of Canadians by breaking the ethics guidelines for elected officials. And even in Manitoba, we have controversy around opening schools, allowing travelers from other provinces to freely roam through the province, and the stigma that comes from people or communities that have positive COVID tests. I do not remember a time in my life when our society has seemed so divided. I heard one church leader describe it as the age of rage. This rage has divided families, communities, churches, and nations, and many people are just looking for a solution to fix our towns, our cities, our provinces, and our nation. And so the pursuit of justice has been thrust back into the forefront. But the pursuit of justice is becoming a catalyst to conflict in the church community as well. Many people are promoting what they see as justice as what God sees as justice. Their political or their affiliation is being pushed out and taught as this is God's affiliation. And what I want to do with this series in the next 4 weeks, and what I want us to do tonight, is to identify the strengths and weaknesses of each theory of justice and to promote Christian unity. Unity was the foundational focus of the early church. This is what one of the early church leaders, Paul, wrote from prison to the church in Ephesus. And it's interesting that this was his theme, and this is what he instructed them. He said, as a prisoner for the Lord, then I urge you to live a life worthy of the calling you have received. Be completely humble and gentle. Be patient, bearing one another in love. Make every effort to keep the unity of the Spirit through the bond of peace. There is one body, one Spirit, and just as you were called to one hope when you were called, one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all, who is over all and through all and in all. And so for the next month, we're going to look at 4 significant justice theories. Libertarianism, liberalism, not to be confused with the Liberal Party of Canada, utilitarianism, and the postmodern justice mindset. And instead of focusing on the labels, this might actually make it easier if we look at how we can describe these four theories. It makes it easier for me. It's justice as it relates to freedom, which we're looking at tonight, justice as it relates to fairness, and Dave Hessler is going to tackle this topic next week, justice as it relates to happiness, and justice as it relates to the distribution of power, and Keegan is going to put himself out on the line on that one, so have fun with that one. But today, like I said, we're going to look at justice as it relates to freedom. I gave you this quote earlier in the questions, but if you've ever watched the movie Braveheart, the one line that you will most likely remember is William Wallace shouting, "They may take our lives, but they will never take our freedom." Let me tell you a little bit about something where I needed to experience freedom this week. And Dan, you can go to the next one. Actually, the next one. Nope, next one. There we go. I participated in a sleep study this week. That's the picture on the brochure. If you can see that, look at the nice calm sleep he is having. That is so far from the truth. I am an active sleeper, I guess, but they have this belt around your diaphragm that you put this thing on your finger and a tube in your nose that they can measure your breathing. I think that lasted maybe 5 minutes like that, and I wake up and I am tied in knots. And then I kind of readjust and go back to sleep. And this happened multiple times that night. By the end of the night, I woke up and the thing in my diaphragm is up around my neck. I can't move. And I'm tired and I'm cranky and the nose tube has come out multiple times. I definitely pulled it out a few times, even with tape being used. And I'm like, they are gonna do the sleep study and they're being like, you stop breathing for 6 hours. I'm like, yeah. And then it was just a nightmare. And all I could think of being a pastor is a Bible verse. And it's also the libertarian theme verse, and it's Hebrews chapter 12. It says, "Since therefore we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders." And that's how I felt. I just about threw that thing through a wall. And the sin that so easily entangles. And let us run with perseverance for the race marked out for us. And so a libertarian mindset would say, let's throw off everything that hinders us from our freedom, and let us throw off everything that entangles us. And so let me talk a little bit about what is the libertarian justice philosophy. Their philosophy is that a just society promotes individual freedom. And this was made popular in the U.S. One of the writers and leaders of that was Robert Nozick in the 1970s. Before this, ironically, the libertarian mindset was always attributed to left-wing anarchist workings. And so, but what happened in the Western culture is it was co-opted, and they believe that in a small number of individual rights, but not entitlements. Persons have the right not to be harmed, an absolute right to private property if fairly earned, and the right to free speech and free association. The first way to guard these rights is to have small government, since high taxes are unjust, and a violation of the right to private property, and large-scale government inevitably seeks to regulate speech, thought, and association. So that is one of their key tenets. The second way is to guard these rights is to have an unregulated free market. The libertarian view is highly individualistic, based on the implicit assumption that every human being belongs to him or herself, and that the outcome of anyone's life is wholly dependent on their individual choices and efforts. And so people who identify with libertarian justice theory will resist any government regulation on their daily lives. This would be a motivating factor for those who protested the lockdown in the early days of the pandemic. A lot of them would come from a libertarian type theory of justice where you are restricting our freedoms, therefore this is unjust, and we are willing to put our lives on the line in order for you not to restrict our freedom. That's where that quote comes back in. They may take our lives, but they will never take our freedom. These people, when you come from that mindset, this mindset feeds into, if you violate my freedom, then, my society is unjust. They're also the most vocal in resisting any government requirement for wearing masks or other limiting factors. And so here's the temptation if you don't hold this view. You get furious. You get angry. You want to mask shame them. Now let me give you a little full disclosure. I forgot, I usually carry my mask in my car, and I drove Rachel's car today. And I came to the church, and because I wasn't going to wear a mask speaking, so I didn't bring one intentionally with me. But I had to run out and run an errand to Best Buy. And I get there, and I'm like, oh no, what if they require masks? How am I going to talk my way into this one? But then I get in line, and everybody's wearing masks, and I really felt like people were looking at me going, privileged white guy doesn't care about masks. And I'm like, oh, sorry, I would wear one if I had one with me. And so, it really, you kind of felt that. I just kind of felt this pressure. I'm like, I sure wish that they had masks at the door, because I was hoping, but so I just extra, hand sanitized myself a few times. Just about put some on my face just to make everybody happy. But, people who come at justice from a libertarian, freedom first mentality would look at the idea of people being forced to wear masks, especially from a government institution. Free market, they can handle that a little bit more, but from a government mindset, would feel like this is completely unjust. And so, we do get furious. Some people get furious. They want to mash him. You may judge them as horrible people. That they would, it's a simple act of wearing a mask, and you're like, it doesn't compute that you would put people's lives at risk. But for them, for people that come from a libertarian type philosophy, this is more than wearing a mask and people getting sick. This is about individual rights and freedoms, and foundational to how they live their lives. And so you get into this mindset, and this is what I want you to remember when you're reading their social media. That freedom is their highest value. That means this is what is most important to them. And that any system or power that threatens individual freedom is fundamentally unjust and cannot be allowed to go unchecked. It's the passionate driving force. Now, if you grew up in a church culture, you will notice and you will probably recognize people that you've grown up with in church that come from this philosophy. The North American evangelical, especially European white-based church, has a lot of people that would subscribe to libertarianism as a key value. And so when they talk about the justice in the society, freedom is their number one thing. And they continue to resonate with that Braveheart quote. And although freedom is important, and there's lots of verses in the Bible about freedom, there's lots of great worship songs about freedom in the Bible. And you could say, Jesus came to give us freedom. Here's what you need to know about the differences between libertarian justice and restorative biblical justice. And this is where the two diverge. First, this view denies the complexity of who we are. We're individuals, yet we're embedded in communities instituted by God, family, state, and created by the image of a three-in-one God. The Bible balances individual freedom with community obligation. And unlike the Bible, libertarianism denies or downplays the role of oppressive social forces in what makes people poor. It refuses to see how sin creates unlevel playing fields that mere individual freedom cannot remedy. So that's the first struggle, and I think that's up on the slides there as well. Second, it denies the doctrine of the universality of sin. It sees the evil capacities of government, but not so much of capital markets. Though human sin is everywhere and will corrupt everything. That's a great statement that I borrowed from Tim Keller, that, you know, human sin is everywhere and will corrupt everything. And so they don't recognize that sin does this even in the midst of freedom. Third, it has a sub-biblical understanding of freedom. Libertarianism usually sees freedom in wholly negative terms. It's freedom from. But we were created by God for loving Him and our neighbor, not just self-interest. And the more we do, and so the more we do what we were created to do, the more free we will be. So the more we love our neighbor, the more freedom we actually have. And this view doesn't account for that. Fourthly, this view's understanding of absolute rights over property and over self does not square with the Bible's view of creation. We belong to God, not to ourselves, and so does everything we own. Whatever we have is ultimately God's gift and must be shared. And so we've talked a little bit about theory today, so how does this impact your life? There are two parts I want you to explore here. If you identify with the libertarian justice theory and are a follower of Jesus, be aware that there are times that you will need to decide between your faith and your philosophical ideas. Remember this, that freedom is neither good nor bad. Just because you are free to make a choice doesn't mean you will make wise choices or good choices. The Bible is full of stories of people whom God gave freedom to make their own choices, and it ended in disaster. Right? You read through it, it's like, man, this is some messed up stuff in here. Well, God gave them the freedom to decide those things. He didn't ultimately intervene. He gave them freedom. And in fact, we don't even have to go to the Bible, do we? If we're honest, we would recognize times in our own lives when we were given freedom, and what did we do? We made bad choices. And you may, oh, no. How many of you have accidentally streamed a whole series on Netflix? Even after Netflix has asked you if you're still there. Or should you do something else? But we've all done stuff based on our choices. So what I want you to be, if you're part of this libertarian justice philosophy, if this is what is a primary motivator for you, be aware of the weaknesses in this philosophy when it comes to the treatment of the poor and disadvantaged. Be aware of being in an echo chamber of same-minded people when you discuss these things, realizing that you're not going to get a clear perspective from the other side. And when I use the term echo chamber, I'm just defining what I mean by it, is that you surround yourself by people with the same philosophy and same outlook in life in such a way that you only hear what you want to hear, and you only hear what you have been saying. And so we need to be careful that we're not living in an echo chamber in this. And the second thing is, if you do not hold the libertarian view of justice, here's what I want you to remember when you interact with Christians who do. Show grace. Just because you don't agree with someone doesn't mean you are to condemn someone else. The Bible strongly warns in the Christian community not to let arguments about politics and government divide them and divide us. Our allegiance is supposed to be to Jesus first, and then our philosophies and political allegiances second. And there's room for every spectrum in God's kingdom. But it needs to be secondary to what Jesus teaches. And that leads us to the second thing, is to be humble. Just because you don't agree doesn't mean you are right and they are wrong. Additionally, in the next few weeks, we will probably identify a theory of justice in which you more strongly identify with. Spoiler alert, you are going to discover that each one of these philosophies do not equal true restorative biblical justice. And so I hope that this message has given you a moment to pause and think about justice and our response to it, because our world needs people to think about it. Our world needs the church to step in and to pray about it and follow the lead of the Holy Spirit. And so I think it's a real important topic for us to cover and for us to look at, but for us to be aware of the pitfalls that we bring into it and the things that divide us. And so if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, again, I just invite you to join me on Zoom on Thursday night at 7 o'clock, or send me messages during the week. It'll be an opportunity for us to discuss this topic. Also look for a series of 5 devotions that will be posted on the Facebook group or to your email on Monday. And so it's just going to cover the rest of this topic out a little bit more and give us an opportunity for you to take some personal study and look at what the Scripture says. And so, I know tonight isn't a real call to action or a push as far as rah, let's inspire you to do something. But I want you to take some time and reflect on how you view justice in this world and how you react to people who don't share your view, especially if you proclaim faith and they proclaim faith. How do we submit our philosophies of justice to Jesus' philosophy of justice and still live together in unity moving forward?